right, so why don't we go ahead and begin? Do you want to come over here? Maybe it's easier.
I have to do.
Well, sort of there. Okay.
All right, good job.
See you later. It's a small group, even when we're all here, which we're not. There's 14 people in the group. So.
And you had to combine them?
Yeah. It is a kind of, one of the things about doing these kinds of classes is that the main attractor for them is word of mouth, and so the first time around they always tend to be pretty small, but we do them anyway so that we can put them out there, and that if people find them useful, usually you'll find yourself talking about them. The process of the class is intense, and so you'll usually find yourself talking about it anyway. Hopefully it'll be a good experience, but it will also be an intense experience. It's intended to be an intense experience. And so I'm hoping that you will find that you're well enough supported in this. We're going to be assigning you mentors, and twice a month you'll have a Skype session with a mentor. It's a one-on-one half-hour discussion. What we want you to go over with your mentor is your understanding of the material that's presented to you, and also your understanding of the meditation techniques that are presented to you, so that we're confident that your understanding and your competency in the meditation practice is developing. You're going to also be given, we're actually going to choose for yourself Dharma buddies. Dharma buddies are people that you'll call once a week and ask them how they're doing, and they'll tell you how they're doing, and then you'll hang up. And then they will call you once a week and they'll ask you how you're doing, and you'll tell them, and then you'll hang up. The Dharma buddy thing is a very rigid protocol, and I want you to keep it that way. I don't want you to combine the phone calls and or have a back and forth in them. The protocol is designed to activate your attachment mechanism, so that you can actually see it working, so that you can explore it. That's the purpose of the Dharma buddy calls. So you'll call up. Mostly the conversation can be about how you're experiencing the class and how it's going for you. But I want you to really get into both of the roles. One is the role of the caregiver, and one is in the role of the person receiving care. And I want you to really be in each of those roles as you participate in that. What you may find is that one of the roles is much easier for you. Either you like to be the caregiver and are uncomfortable receiving care, or you like to receive care and you're not comfortable being the caregiver, and that's what the calls are supposed to point out. 6 mornings a week, there's going to be guided meditation. I think that you mostly should have been invited to that already. Is that the case? Okay. Then, what? Morning meditation? You should have been invited to that already. The meditation instruction is largely going to be in morning meditation and also the practice. It's an intensive, so I really want you to be meditating 6 days a week for a minimum of 25 minutes. One of the things about approaches that are embedded in meditation is that they don't actually work if you don't meditate. They do work really well if they meditate, and that's also can be an area of difficulty because they'll begin to cause shifts, and sometimes the shifts are hard to equanimize or balance. So right now we're doing a basic forgiveness practice. We're going to do forgiveness practice and move then into metta practice. We're doing a basic concentration practice on the vipassana side. I'm teaching a metta vipassana, an integrated metta vipassana, And I teach concentration separately, so it's a wet, we would call this a wet Vipassana. Mostly what you're used to, and the wet and dry terms are different in when applied to metta or when applied to Vipassana. In a wet Vipassana practice, that means that there's a component of the practice which is exclusively focused on the development of concentration. And a dry Vipassana practice means there's no special focus on developing concentration. In the West, the way that it's organized, mostly Vipassana has been taught as a retreat practice. And so your instruction for Vipassana would be mostly given to you on retreat. So you'd go up to, say, Spirit Rock, or you'd go out to IMS, or my teacher, primary teacher, was Shinzen, and so you'd go on one of his retreats, or if you use me as a teacher, you'd come on my retreats. And if you went on a week-long retreat and you went on 1 or 2 retreats a year, you'd have enough practice to develop a sufficient amount of concentration that you could then go into the insight practice and be able to do it. How many people go on at least 1 retreat a year here? So some of you are not going on 1 retreat a year. How many on 2? So really, in order to develop concentration at a deep enough level to not have to have an independent concentration practice, 2 retreats, I would say, would be the minimum. So if you don't do that, then you're going to have a separate focused concentration practice in order to develop enough concentration to be able to do insight practice at a deep enough level for there to be much effect from it. So what we're trying to develop is called access concentration. Access concentration is the minimum level of concentration that you need in order to get into both metta practice or into Vipassana or insight practice. Because I like things to be testable and definable, I like to have ready definitions of these things, and so I would call access concentration being able to count up and down from 10 at the end of the out-breath for a period of 10 minutes without getting caught up in thinking and losing the count even once. So one up and down to 10. Everybody know what I mean by that? I would say that if you did a basic concentration practice 3 times a week for 10 minutes, which is how it's built into morning meditation, it'll take you 2 or 3 months to get to that level of concentration. It's not a high bar. But if you're not doing something intentionally to develop concentration, just doing an insight practice or a metta practice, you won't be able to develop enough concentration. So the focus in the beginning is to make sure that you have access concentration, and then you can go into the insight practices. The other thing about it is that you want to be able to withdraw from difficulty in practice without having to stop meditating. And concentration practice is a good way to do that. You can feel a calming of the body-mind and a pleasantness of the body-mind, and that tends to cool down some of the difficulty that can arise in insight practice. I want you to feel confident to be able to go into deep insight practice, and in order to do that, you need to feel that you can get out of difficulty if you get into it. So maybe we should, in some sense, define what difficulty is when it arises in insight practice. We are often organized around distracting ourselves from things that are unpleasant. We often use both suppression and repression to cope with things that are emotionally distressing to us. Do you know the difference between suppression and repression? So, suppression is a conscious choice to focus away from the thing that's disquieting, and that's actually a useful skill to have. I often talk about intentionally suppressing things. The Buddha talked about it. It's part of the right effort, intentionally suppressing. Afflictive thinking is a useful thing to be able to do. Repression is an unconscious activity where the body-mind makes the decision for you not to allow a conscious awareness of a particular experience or information because it's too distressing. A lot of us will have had experiences that are suppressed, and a lot of us will have experiences that are repressed. The repressed experience doesn't go away, it's just not conscious. And if you have the habit of repressing experiences, then what you'll notice is that there's a lot of energy, a lot of somaticized energy in the body that will then have to come to bring into consciousness, to release. It uses up a lot of energy to hold a lot of repressed experience. You don't get to know what the repressed experience is, you just get to know the energy of it and the emotion of it. The suppressed material, sometimes you can remember the details of what it was. But often we have histories, we have experiences that are painful to us that we would prefer not to have to deal with. And in the practice of meditation, we come into contact with them and they come into consciousness. And if you're not able to hold the experiences well enough, by hold, I mean to be with them in consciousness and equanimity, then the body-mind will move to regulate them. And that will put us in an awareness of our, I like to call them self-generated emotional regulation strategies, but what you might think of them as thinking. So something happens in the present moment, you have a response to it. If it falls in the normal bandwidth of things that you can deal with, you simply let it roll through. And if it doesn't, you have an emotional event that needs to be regulated, and most of us regulate by thinking. If you pay attention to what you think, then you'll know that sometimes you think things that are afflictive. You have an experience of sadness and you generate rage as a way of not having to have the experience of sadness, or the experience of fear, and then you generate the experience of sadness as a way of dampening it down. All of these experiences you will have generated, you will have learned to do as a child in the family system that you grew up in, because we don't come into the world with the skill set to know what emotions are or to regulate them. We're taught both of those things by our caregivers. So depending on how skillful your family systems were in dealing with these things, how nuanced they are in their approach to them will be your level of skill, unless you've intentionally developed beyond that. And you'll know whether you've done that. Some people go into therapy to try and do that. Some people have other approaches that they've tried to do with that. One of the things about attachment, which is a lot of what this class is oriented around, is that you were exhibiting already at 10 months old your attachment strategy. So by 10 months old, already the effect of your conditioning through the relationship with your primary caregiver resulted in you making certain choices about yourself and also about the world, and then you began to take actions in the world. So in some sense, your karma from a very early age has been oriented in how you reacted to your earliest conditioning. And sometimes when you begin to see the pattern of that also can be unsettling. And so that's another thing that can be challenging to look at. I do like to take all of the blame out of this. I usually run the question by you, and you've probably all heard me say this. What could you have done at 10 months to divert your attachment strategy, or to head it in a better direction if it wasn't the most ideal conditioning? I think most of us will come to the conclusion that there wasn't anything that we could have done, that we absorbed the conditioning that was offered to us because we had no other option but to do that. And that actually we did it rather well. The window of opportunity opened and we learned what was taught to us, and then we learned it well enough to then employ it, and then we employed it. And our body-mind has actually been working hard to do its very best for us with the tools that it has. And that it will continue to do that. And if we improve the quality of the tools that we have, the outcomes will be better for us. That the karma that we create from the actions that we take will be better if we have more skillful tools, but that the body-mind itself has always been attempting to act in our own best interest and being very diligent about doing that. That's at least my impression of this. I want you to know that you have these 2 classes a month, you have the 2 mentoring sessions a month, you have your 2 Dharma buddy sessions a week. You have the 6 mornings of morning meditation. If you call in 6 mornings a week, you can ask me a question, and we hope that that's enough support for you. But if it isn't, then you should let us know, because some people like to have, in addition to that, or some people may already have some support by a psychotherapist, which is probably an option that if you want to have is a good idea. If you don't know somebody that you would work with but might want to do that, we can refer you to somebody, because we have people in our network that we work with. I am not able to evaluate you as to whether or not that's something that you should be doing. I'm not licensed. I'm a meditation teacher. But if you wanted that, you need to let us know, and we'll help you with that. We do have people who are licensed who can help. But I really want you to not feel that you're not well enough supported, and if it starts to get a little bit wonky, which sometimes it can, just let us know, and we will really move strongly to make sure that you feel well enough supported. Is that good enough and clear enough? There's going to be a lot of material, a lot of information that's presented. There's going to be a Dropbox that's going to be filled with information. The first, there's going to be 3 books that we want you to read. The first one is called A General Theory of Love, and I will put a PDF in the Dropbox for you to read. This is the neuroscience of attachment, basically. One of the things that happens to people when they're conditioned into attachment is that your brain grows in accordance with your conditioning. So this isn't simply a matter of changing your mind about this. It's also going to be a matter of changing the physical structure of your brain so that it responds differently. One of the reasons that attachment is not affected much by psychotherapy is because the part of the brain that needs to be affected the most isn't affected by psychotherapy. So psychotherapy is really good with autobiographical memory or chronological memory, but not so great with procedural memory. The reason that I think meditation is so useful for all of this is that meditation is largely a function of procedural memory. So again, this is pointing to practice, really needing to practice heavy for this. It also points to all of this material stirring up distress, and then if you don't practice, we're not really offering an alternative other than that, right? So I don't want to be too scary, but I also want to point out that in my experience of teaching this class, it brings up a lot of stuff. It's called an intensive. I suppose one of the things that happened to me is that I did a lot of work in a lot of different ways, and what I noticed is that the habitual patterns didn't change much, and I kept doing the same things over and over. I could recognize them and I could repair them, but I couldn't get the body-mind to not do them in the first place, and I was in a state of frustration over it. And I heard a lecture by Alan Shore, who's a researcher at UCLA, and he described a disorganized attachment strategy and what the pattern of a life of somebody who had that with, and it was in 5 minutes he described the first 40 years of my life, having never met me, and it was such a relief that there was a thing called disorganized attachment, because I'd tried so many different things to get an explanation for why my life kept going the way that it went. And looking into the ways of being able to change that, the thing that really had the biggest impact for me was the meditation piece. A lot of this is going to be around emotional regulation, so we're going to really need to get into looking at these systems for emotional regulation, which is then going to push us into the experience of our early childhood experiences, and some of that can be difficult to look at, particularly if you're still preserving the good caregiver, bad child paradigm that a lot of us live with. That probably isn't going to be able to hold up too well in this investigation. If you can change the procedural memory, what you're actually doing is changing the dynamic, the physical structure of the brain. But when you think about it, when you're born, your brainstem is intact, your midbrain is partially formed, that's your emotional or limbic system, and your cortexes, your frontal cortexes are hardly formed. And so in interaction to the caregiver that you have, all of these physical structures are formed. And so you're walking around with a living model of the relationship to your caregivers. And you respond in that way. So if you, for instance, the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems are supposed to be in a dance with each other. The sympathetic nervous system activates, and if the threat is judged not real, the parasympathetic is supposed to come in and dampen it down. In people who have secure attachment, it's a marvelous dancing thing. And in people who have insecure attachment, not so much. It's evident. And it isn't a decision you make, it's the physical structure of the brain, and so then you have to recondition that so that these linkages are being, and this is 4 areas of the brain, the amygdalas, which are the sympathetic, the hippocampus, which is the parasympathetic, the orbital frontal cortex, which is the corresponding link between, and then the corpus callosum, which is the information about threat history, right? All of those things work together to create this balance. Are you going to intervene?
I am.
It sounds like a recording. In LA we have, it's usually Ricky, and he has a small bullhorn, and he starts talking about Jesus.
What are the other 2 books?
Oh,
3 books I started writing down.
Oh, I'm sorry. The second one is called Attachment and Psychotherapy by David Wallen. And the third one is called A Secure Base by John Bowlby. John Bowlby called it a secure base. In Freud, Ziggy, said that there were two great forces in life. One was to love and one was to work. John Bowlby said that there were two great forces in life. One was to attach and one was to explore, which maps pretty well onto that. But what he said was that in order to be able to explore, you need to have a secure base. And so that's where the title comes from. That a child who has a secure base becomes a great explorer because they have a place that they can come back to and touch into. I was reading another attachment guy, an Italian guy whose name is not coming to mind, but he said that for most of us, we don't have a secure base. Most of us just have a plain old base, and that we would really do well if we'd had a secure base, but most of us don't have that. We just have the base, and we adapt to the conditions of the base that we have and learn to operate from there. But if you notice a small child, if they have a secure base, they're in constant visual contact with the base, and it frees them to go explore, and they can't wait to come back and share the quality of their exploration. And if they have a caregiver who's interested, and then they get a joy in sharing, and the person that they share with gets a joy in learning what that was. But if you didn't have that, then you didn't learn that. And so it isn't that you can't have it now, it's that you need to learn that it's available and then learn how to do it. One of the difficulties of the adult life is that the learning is harder now. The learning is harder now because the physical structure of the brain is different now. So you have to take these things into account. A child's brain is a mass of unconnected axions. So you want to learn something, there's all of this real estate in the brain that just attaches to it. It just connects to it. It's just a warrant of axions waiting for any stimulation to connect. And when you hit puberty, there is a radical pruning. Anything that isn't connected is removed down to the barest scaffolding. Only the things that are connected are preserved. Everything else is removed. It gives you a huge boost in your cognitive ability, but it makes learning really hard in comparison to what a child's brain is like. So it takes big effort to learn in an adult brain that it doesn't take in a child's brain. If you think about it, and now, 0 words to how many words did you learn by the age of 5 or 10? 20,000, 50,000, how many? For instance, if you had parents who insisted that you try a lot of different foods, remember the kid who didn't want to eat the broccoli and eat the broccoli, eat the bean, eat this, eat that, eat that. The parent that insisted that you try a lot of foods, which is a good parenting, incidentally. Then you have a rich palate. And if you had a parent who didn't do that for you, you don't. And to learn to have a rich palate as an adult is really hard. That's the level of this kind of learning. If you didn't learn all of the subtle tastes differences because your parents insisted that you try different foods, you tend to have a very plain palate now. I mean, if you look at my dad as an example, he once told my mother that he would never eat another meal in our house if she put garlic in the food again. Because his mother was an Irish woman who boiled everything. Every vegetable was boiled. Salt and pepper, that was the extent of the seasoning. So,
I had a question. What exactly is the pruning process that happens, and why?
Well, in a child's brain, it's just a warren of disconnected axions waiting for stimulation. So any kind of stimulation that a child has, there's an easy connection, so that's very fast learning. But it's also a warren of disconnected axions, so the processing is slow and the logic is not refined. And so when you come into puberty, so depending on when that happens, anything that's not connected is, any axion that's not connected is removed. So,
How and why?
well, it's simply removed. What the word is?
Is it physically in you?
It's physically removed in the same way that any dead cell is physically removed from the body. Down to anything, only to the things that are connected. So it's a kind of scaffolding of things that are connected. And what you get out of that, and the reason for it, is you get a big boost in intellect, and a big boost in cognitive thinking, so that you move from a child level of ability to think to an adult level, but at a cost of the speed of learning.
I see.
Bummer. It's only a bummer if you didn't have a lot of stimulation when you were a kid, because then you missed that easy point of learning, and the stuff that you have to learn now is much harder. It isn't that you can't learn it, it's just much harder to learn it now. Uh-huh.
What happens if you hit adolescence, right, and all this stuff's happening, and you dump a bunch of LSD in there?
I don't know, lots of visuals. I guess there's chromosomal changes and this and that happens.
But I mean, would it stunt brain development?
I don't know that anybody knows the answer. I guess that it would connect certain axions and they would stay, and and the ones that weren't connected would go. But it's at all levels. That's why I talk about food. If you didn't have that parent shoving the piece of broccoli at you with a fork, demanding that you eat it, if they didn't give you a wide range of foods, then you may notice that you don't eat a wide range of tastes, and it's because you didn't grow the capacity to taste them. And you could do that now, but you'd have to endure the tasting process. That's the exploration, right? You don't naturally explore it because you didn't learn to do it. But you could do it now if you wanted to, rather than just eat the same things. Did you learn to read or not learn to read? Did you read for enjoyment or just for work? What were all of those things that happened? Did they plunk you in front of the TV because they needed to do something else? What happened to you? And what did you learn from that? And is it a good way of being? Is it a good way of exploring? Do you explore the world, this vast, interesting, complex world, in a way that's interesting to you so that you're excited and fulfilled by it, or do you not do that? And if you don't do that, what is it that prevents you from going out there and doing it? That's what we really want to look at. To attach and to explore, and what is the balance between that? What is the balance between your efforts to explore and your efforts to attach? And do you make relationships that accommodate that? Do you have somebody that's excited to learn about your exploration, or do they inhibit it? Do you have somebody that also doesn't explore, so the two of you hole up together so you don't explore together? How is it that you actually work that out, right? Whoops. See, So this is what this is the class. This is the purpose of the class. The meaningful life is the life where you're exploring and you're engaged in relationship with other people, and there's a dynamic between the two that's in balance. And then, so we need to examine where you're at, what needs to happen. Some people are going to be really good at exploring, not so good at connecting. Some people are going to be good at connecting but don't explore, and there's going to be a balance that needs to happen. And some fixes are easier than others depending on what happened. And so we want to begin to examine all of that. And then we also want to be, mostly what we're really talking about is emotional regulation, so we're going to also really go into the examination of the emotional regulation for this stuff. And it's all meditation based. So part of this is the metta practice, part of it is the vipassana practice. Metta practice is looking at and replacing afflictive emotion, the use of afflictive emotion as a way of emotionally regulating. So something happens, you have an emotional event that needs to be regulated, and most of us will use thinking as a way of doing that, examining how we do it. You're going to have a whole range of skills to do that based on your family conditioning. Some of them are going to be beneficial, some of them are going to be afflictive. We want to pull apart the afflictive ones from the beneficial ones. We're going to reinforce the beneficial ones and stop using the afflictive ones. And in the stop using of the afflictive ones, we may notice that there's a deficit of skill. And then we're going to need to learn new skills to replace the afflictive emotions so that you still have the capacity to regulate. You don't actually have a choice about emotional regulation, you have to regulate. What you have a choice about is how you do it if you're willing to retrain the mind to regulate it in a different way than it regulates. But the way that you've been conditioned to regulate, you have been using since you were, 10 months old. I mean, you've been using it a long time. It works really well. It may not be beneficial, but it works really well. And the new stuff is not going to work as well, and so it's going to be a kind of back and forth of pushing in the stuff that doesn't work so well, refining it, making it work better, and insisting that the mind use that rather than the afflictive stuff. And when you do that enough, the body-mind will take it up because it's not afflictive. It's better for you, and it actually is. It has your interest in mind. It wants to use the better way, and it will. Is that making sense? So with the forgiveness practice, I'm going to give some instruction. You're going to, we're starting with self. Really, the idea is to forgive everything. A lot of these ideas that we have, a lot of these assignments of blame that we have are part of the conditioning. They're often holding up this double bind of the good caregiver, bad child. In double binds, you can let go of either side. It doesn't matter which side you let go of. You can preserve the good parent if you want to, but you can, by not being the bad child anymore. You can be the good child, and they can be the good parent. Or you can let go of them being the good parent, and in that way undo being the bad child. You can let go of both sides of it. Really what you want to be able to do is come into a place where you can actually see it in balance, see what actually happened. What we're talking about is your needs being met. How well did you get your needs met? Often what happens to people is that they think that if they evaluate the conditions of their childhood as not good enough, it means that they weren't lovable or that they weren't loved. And this is not what I'm saying. And I really want to pull apart these two things. Love is one thing, and the care you received is another. Very often we have caregivers, our parents, our mothers and fathers who loved us and who wanted to do the very best for us. And that was their total intention and the effort that they put into it. And at the same time, the care that they provided for you was not the care that you needed. They may have provided good care, and it may have been not the right care for you. That's often what happens. I know with my dad, he said to me, "I don't know why you're whining. I provided for you the childhood I always wanted." That it had nothing to do with me, was a separate issue entirely, right? So did you get the care that you needed so that you could flourish in the way that you were? And if you didn't, can you see that? And at the same time understand that the intention of your caregivers may have been to be loving and to do well for you. Is that okay as an idea? So you can free them up, and you can also free yourself up so that you can begin to see what happened, so that since you are now the person in charge of this, that you can begin to provide for yourself the things that will make your life meaningful, make your life rich, make you want to get up and go do it. The time for them, anyway, is over. And it's all on you pretty much now, anyway. One of the things about that, of course, is that you have to be willing to sit into the terrible sadness of what's already lost, but it's already lost. And there's great freedom in that. If you don't make space, nothing new can come in. If you preserve the idea, or you still try to get fulfillment from the thing that's already lost, you don't make space for the new thing that can be fulfilling to come in. So this process of grieving, is that making sense? How is everybody doing? Okay? I don't want to bury you. At the same time, I want to prepare you. Uh-huh.
You said it a long time ago, but it seems less heavy. What was the wet vipassana again?
Wet vipassana is where there's an intentional concentration practice, and dry vipassana is where there is not.
Oh, okay.
And a wet metta is where you are intentionally invoking a feeling of metta, and a dry metta is where you're using concentration as the way of developing metta. You're mostly going to be familiar with a wet metta in the way that it's taught in the West. You say a phrase, or you have a thought that's intended to produce a feeling in the body, so you're tracking a feeling state in the body. The near enemy of metta is sentimentality, and the problem with the wet metta is that it's very easy to get caught up in the generation of the emotion, which would be the near enemy, not true metta. True metta is awareness of the present moment, and the feeling state of positivity is secondary to that. You're in the mind state of metta, so that I like to teach it as a concentration practice, so that you're tracking whether or not you're in the mind state of metta, and the feeling that comes from that is secondary. You can go more easily into metta jhana, which is the highly concentrated state of metta, and then you get a much more intense experience of bliss by being in metta jhana than you would from a sentimental metta anyway. But you're also in the experience of the mind state of metta rather than caught up in the near enemy of metta. Uh-huh.
Can you describe the mind state of metta?
The mind state of metta is calm, it's cool, so there's no heat in it. Heat would be a word to describe some kind of, say, longing or craving. And it's kind. So the mind state of kindness, what would that be like? If you look at it, mind state as the thing, you have the capacity to sense, the raw sensing experience, and then you have the thing that it's fixated into. And between those two is the mind state. It's like a filter. So you have the sensing experience, and then say you have dosa, anger there. The sensing experience is filtered through anger, and then the thing you fixate is filled with anger, right? Does that, you know what I'm using anger because it's such a common thing. So you have a sensing experience, but the whole world seems angry. Or the experience of anger affects entirely the way that the world presents itself. Everything is wrong in anger. But if you insert instead of anger the mind state of kindness, then the sensing experience as you fixate it into self and world is imbued with a sense of kindness. But it is calm, it is cool, that is without any heat, any craving, any longing, any sensual desire, any sexual desire, all of that's absent, and it is kind.
So is there a mind state for forgiveness and equanimity and all the others?
I think there is.
So then in the practice we should focus on that mind state, like if we're in forgiveness practice now, rather than the sentimental part of it.
Forgiveness in some sense is a Western construct. The mind state is actually one of patience. So that would be the mind state you were looking for. In forgiveness, the mind state is patience. They often describe it as the patience that you would bring to a child. So you have a child tantruming. Can you come to the child with patience in not reacting with the sense of self arising in reaction to the child tantruming? Do you have that experience? Do you know what I'm talking about? That a child does something egregious to you and you have total patience with it because they're a child, right? You can see that they're not affronting you, that they're in distress, you can see their suffering, and you move from a place of compassion, from a place of patience to attempt to relieve their suffering with no sense of being attacked in their gesture. That would be the mind state. And actually they suggest that you bring that degree of patience to adults as well without infantilizing them, right? So can you come to an adult who you see in obvious distress with that level of patience, with that level of kindness, without creating a sense of self in response to that needs to be defended because you feel attacked by their outburst. Compassion is narrowly focused on the experience of someone else's suffering. It's a willingness to be present for and contain somebody else's suffering. So.
That's different though than containing it versus not entangling with it. How do you not infantilize if you're containing?
Well,
There's a subtle difference.
I tend to like to talk about these things as skill sets, and so in compassion you attune to somebody, so you connect. The attunement, which is connection, so your attention is on them, you notice that their attention is on you. You allow an empathetic connection to form between you, so you feel compassionate empathy, so feeling a representation of their feeling state in your body, And then in that compassionate container, you bring your emotional regulation skills to their suffering, and in an attempt to help co-regulate them, to help bring them back into balance. Where you would get enmeshed is if the experience of their suffering overwhelmed you, and you then were unwilling to disconnect from them to preserve your own well-being. But if you found that you connected to somebody and their suffering was overwhelming, it would be more skillful to disconnect from them rather than attempt to regulate them beyond what you were capable of. Is that making sense? What happens is we attempt a compassionate embrace with somebody, and their suffering overwhelms us, and then maybe out of afflictive guilt we're unwilling to disconnect from them, and so that rather than being able to hold them, we're overwhelmed by their suffering. That would not be compassionate. That would be overwhelmed. How many of us are there? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Somebody else is missing.
There's 11.
There's 11. So this class is also a relational class, and we're going to spend a lot of time doing relational things in it. We're going to break up into quads now. And this is an exercise of exploring who we may want to have as Dharma buddies. So we're going to sit in quads, and each person is going to have 5 minutes to talk about, so say your name, why you came to the class, what your meditation experience is, and what you hope to get out of the class. Those things. And each person will have 5 minutes. We'll go around, and at the end of the 5 minutes, there'll be 5 minutes for open discussion in the group, and then we'll do a second dyad and hopefully in each group you'll have people that you haven't met before, so that we'll have, each person should be able to sit with 6 other people that they haven't sat with before. And then at the end of that, you'll pick somebody to be your Dharma buddy for the first 2 months of the class. Each 2 months of the class, we're going to add a Dharma buddy. This has to do with Dunbar numbers, which we'll talk more about, but Dunbar is a French neuroscientist who was researching how many relationships actually do you need to have, and what he concluded was that in the closest number of relationships that you need to have is between 3 and 6. 3 and 6 people. So an A relationship would be somebody that you take care of on a daily or every other day basis. A B relationship would be somebody that you take care of on a weekly or every other week basis. This is actually being physically with. And that these are people that you tell everything to. That's the basis of an A and B relationship. Most people like to have one A relationship because it's so resource intensive, and most people like to have a sexual component to that relationship, although it's not necessary. And then the range of B relationships was between 2 and 5 for most people. That was like in the bell curve, that was pretty much the center of it. So I don't know where everybody's relationships are, but I thought that it was an interesting experiment to see how many B-level relationships you might like to have. So the Dharma buddy thing is based on the Dunbar numbers. So for the first 2 months of the class, you'll have 1 Dharma buddy, and then for the second 2 months you'll have 2, and then for the third 2 months you'll have 3, and then for the fourth 2 months you'll have 4, and then for the last month of the class you'll have 5. Now, not everybody is willing to do that, and you can call a halt at a certain point, but for the first couple rounds you'll have to take somebody. Is that making sense?
It makes sense, but doesn't the protocol kind of limit the quality of the relationship which could be had?
In what way?
I expect a certain reciprocity can be a relationship. If I tell them something, I don't want them to hang up and activate my attachment.
Oh. Well, you can hum and you can ask questions if you need clarity, but the roles need to be really clear. One person is calling to ask how you are, and you're telling them.
Okay.
And then the call is over. And then in the second call, you're calling to ask them how they are, and they're telling you.
So is the goal to be activated and to deal with that yourself, or is the goal to have a little bit of co-regulation because you're checking in with a Dharma buddy?
Why can't you have co-regulation in each of the roles?
I imagine that's for my own exploration. I don't know.
I don't either. That's what the exploration is for.
Okay.
Then you have your mentors and everybody else, and if it's too activating, then you need to tell us and we'll figure something out. So let's see how we're going to do this.
Oh, and George, just a question, like a team with another person, like everybody, do you suggest we pick other people to be our Dharma buddies?
I do. So let's make that one group. Let's make that one group. Wait, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. There's 10.
Someone left, so we have to.
Oh.
She had to leave.
So it's more complicated. So we're going to have 3 groups of 3 and 1 group of 4. Okay? So we'll have 1, 1, and 1. Okay? So I want you to sit in chairs facing each other.
So are we 3 or 4?
You're 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and then 1, 2, 3, 4.
Oh,